I'm 26 years old, and this year I settled on a house. I'd been living with my roommates for the past almost 8 years, and seclusion is something I value, so finally buying a home for myself was a huge achievement. It was in a neighboring town about 2 hours out from where I used to live. This town was much smaller in scale and had way less buildings. That's not to say every house was on a farm or anything, but the neighborhoods were definitely not full of close-together rows of houses. They were spread out, separated by fields of trees and grass. The home I bought was no exception, being modest and among the less expensive side of the housing market. It was out in a forest a few miles away from the market center in the area, not the neighbors or the townspeople, and with the house being so far out, with trees blocking the surrounding views, it really felt like I was moving out into the middle of nowhere, completely alone. Saying it like that makes it sound more eerie than it really felt, but it wasn't all that comforting of a thought either. I had a rental van for the day, so I got to work right away unloading my things into the house. To be as quick as possible, I tried to put pretty much everything right in the living room rather than sorting it as I go. This took a few hours, and the sun was coming down just as I was finishing up. I set down a few boxes in the house and started walking out to the driveway for the last couple of boxes, but was caught off guard by a man standing on my porch, almost blocking the whole front door. He startled me, making me jump a bit before showing slight embarrassment and asking what he was here for. The man, looking about 50 or so, smiled and introduced himself as my new neighbor. I said it was nice to meet him and made a short smile, but couldn't really help but think about how I never saw him walking up the driveway to my house. In fact, I had no idea where he came from, given it was just forest around my house. The man stayed there, just kind of looking at me for a second. It then turned and walked off my porch. I stood and just soaked in the strangeness of the encounter. After a moment, though, I stepped back outside and quickly got the rest of the boxes into the house. I checked out the windows to make sure the man was gone, and I didn't see him anywhere. So after a minute, I went out and got in the van, driving it down the long dirt driveway. It had only been a few minutes since the man had left, yet I didn't see him walking as I drove down to the main road. There were no other paths that I was aware of, so this made me a bit more uneasy. Anyway, I returned the van and got a local taxi back home, then started on unpacking. I wasn't working fast because I was already tired and it was late, but I wanted to get some of the furniture put together before calling it a night. I grabbed the pieces to my bed frame and lugged them into my bedroom, beginning to piece it together before a sudden knock interrupted me. I stopped and listened, kind of shaken by it. I got up and quietly walked up to the front door. I kept the door shut and locked, but looked out the peephole and saw the same man from during the day. But this time something was off about him, more so than before. His body was shaky, with his head moving around in an uncanny way, but his eyes were fixed on the doorknob. He was staring at it intensely, standing close to the door as if waiting eagerly for me to open it. "Hey, it's your neighbor. Can you open the door?" he yelled, and then knocked again. I still remained on the other side, looking through the peephole. His face began to show frustration and anger, and he banged on the door one more time. He then turned and faced the pitch-black forest, looking out into the darkness. He held his hand up and did some sort of waving motion, followed by him running out into the forest in the direction he waved at. Terrified, I immediately called the police, but it was too late for them to be found and questioned. After that night, though, I never saw the man again. Even to this day, I now have met my neighbors, and of course, none of them were that man, and nobody in town seems to recognize him from my descriptions. I don't know who the man was signaling to in the forest, or even how many people could have been out there, waiting for the man to gain my trust and get me to open the door. What would have happened afterwards, I believe, is best left unthought of. My wife and I live in a normal suburb. We have normal jobs, normal lives next to normal neighbors. We live the, I guess you'd say, standard American lifestyle that most of us are taught by our parents to achieve. Me sitting down to write this story is already saying something because I'm not a writer. The last time I typed something out this long was the last paper I wrote in college. But something happened not that long ago that no one can explain, and after work we decided to go out to eat for a change, and we got back around 9. We don't stay up very late on work nights, so by 9:30 we were brushing our teeth, getting ready for bed. By 10 o'clock, we were in bed, and we usually shut the lights off at 11. We either read our books or watch our show. Tonight we were watching our show. Then the phone rang. Gianna told me not to answer it. Anyone calling at this hour can't be good news. I agreed with her. But for that reason, I said I should pick it up in case it's an emergency. So I reached over for the phone next to the bed to pick it up, but it stopped ringing before I could actually lift the receiver. That old landline was trash. The second the call stopped, the caller ID would disappear, and there wasn't a way to check the call history. Oh well, wrong number. But a few minutes later, the phone rang again, so I grabbed the phone and looked at the screen. It said unknown number. Gianna and I both thought that was unusual, especially past 10 o'clock. I feel that there's a generally accepted cutoff time for phone calls, and that's after 9 p.m. I didn't pick up the phone, but right after it stopped ringing, the phone rang again. Suddenly it felt like it was an emergency, like God forbid something happened to a relative. So I picked up in a hurry. On the other end was the voice of my neighbor Al. He asked me if I knew that man standing out in front of my house. I said, "What are you talking about?" He told me to go outside and hung up. I found it insanely bizarre the way he just hang up abruptly like that. Gianna's face when I told her what Al just said was a look of fear. She said, "Don't go out there." I said, "I'm just going to look out the window." I went downstairs and moved the curtain a bit to look out to the front lawn. There was definitely no one standing outside. I opened the front door and then the storm door and stepped out to the front stoop. I looked around and looked into the bushes right in front of the house. Nobody. So I got a little annoyed at the idea that Al would prank call us this late on a work night. It also just felt a little out of character for him to do that. I went back to bed and told Gianna that no one was out there and Al was probably messing with us. She was just as confused by that as I was. It just felt bizarre. She told me to call him, and so I did. But it rang and went straight to voicemail. So I left a voicemail saying, "Hey Al, what was that call about? Give me a call back." Then the phone rang. It said unknown caller again. I picked up and it was Al again, saying before I could even say anything, "Go outside, there's someone standing outside your house." He said it in a calm, slow voice. Then he hung up. I got up and said out loud, "All right, what the hell is going on?" I told Gianna to wait here. I went downstairs and back to the window. I looked through the curtain, and this time I saw someone standing right at the end of our walkway where it met the sidewalk. He had a hood over his head, effectively covering his face to just blackness. I was honestly shaken. I opened my door and said outside, "Can I help you?" The man just stood in place. I threatened him with calling the police. Then the house phone rang again. I closed the front door and went to the kitchen phone, and this time noticed the caller ID showed my neighbor Al's number. I picked up, and Al said in a much more normal voice, "Hey, I just got your voicemail. What was that about?" "I didn't call you. I was so confused. I swore to him he just called me twice telling me about a man outside my house. He sounded even more confused than me. Then moments later he said he doesn't see anyone outside my house. I went back out to look out the window and that man who was standing outside my house was gone. I demanded Al tell me right now if this was a joke and if I found out it was and he wouldn't tell me we'd have a problem. Al claimed he was telling the truth and he's not some immature prankster kind of guy. He's a very low-key, respectful person. I had to put him on speaker so Gianna could vouch for me that I wasn't going crazy, and that we did in fact get 2 calls from someone who sounded just like him. He did the same and put his wife on the phone as well to vouch for him. In the end, what could he really say though, except for it sounds like someone was pranking us. Eventually, we got off the phone, but I was no less horrified than I was before none of us could ever figure out this unexplainable situation. A couple years ago, I moved to a new apartment to be closer to work. My old stuff was pretty worn out, so I ditched most of it during the move. That saved me the hassle of having to rent a van, and I was able to do it with just my car. Once I got to my new place, I ordered a bed online since that was the only thing I really needed immediately. The rest could wait. I had a 1-bedroom apartment, so I wanted a couch, a table, and a desk at least. Probably a bed frame eventually, but a mattress on the floor was fine for a while. None of that was urgent though, so I turned to Facebook Marketplace, hoping to find a good deal. First time I opened it, there was nothing, but I would check every few days. After a week or so, I stumbled upon an ad that seemed like a pretty good find. The guy was selling a few things that I needed: a desk, a table and chairs, and a small couch. No bed frame. But that was the least important thing on my list. The photos looked decent, and the prices were fair. The seller was Matthew, and his profile looked legit. He'd been on Facebook since 2009, and his profile looked real, so I trusted him. He gave me the address, and I told him I would be there later in the week. However, he insisted that it had to be that day. I had plans for later, but it was too good to pass up, so I told him I would be there. My car was pretty small, so I arranged to borrow my friend's SUV, which was a little bigger. It would still probably be at least 2 trips, though. When I arrived, I saw Matthew, a middle-aged guy with a scruffy beard and long hair. He was waiting for me at the front. He seemed nice enough at first and offered to help me load the stuff into the car. However, I really needed to use the bathroom. I was embarrassed, but I asked him if I could. He nodded, pointing me down the hall. As I was washing my hands, a faint banging noise caught my attention. It was coming from one of the vents. I leaned in, listening. It's when I heard it, a muffled scream. It sounded like somebody was calling for help. My first thought was that this guy had somebody locked in his basement. No, it sounds crazy, but what else could it be? The sound got louder, and then I was sure that it was real. I walked out, trying to keep my cool. The guy was waiting near the front door, eyeing me with a curious look. I felt a gnaw in my stomach, trying to figure out my next move. Then, out of nowhere, he mentioned that he had a horror movie playing in the back room. The explanation was a bit too convenient. We stood there in an awkward silence for a few seconds, each sizing the other up. The sound that I heard was too loud to ignore, and I thought he knew that I was suspicious. As we stood there, I heard it again, but tried to pretend that I didn't notice. I could tell that he was suspicious. His next excuse was even more bizarre. He said that his wife was in the basement playing a joke. That was my cue to leave. I ran for the car, not even bothering to take the furniture. It didn't look like he was following me as I got out of that neighborhood. Once I was a good distance away, I called the police, explaining everything, from the Facebook ad to the strange noises in the vent. They told me that they'd check it out and asked me to stay on the line. I pulled over and parked at a nearby shopping mall, ready to help if the cops needed me. As I later found out, the police arrived at the house, and when they rang the doorbell, nobody answered. Just like me, they heard the screams, so that gave them the cause to search the house. They broke a window and went in. What they found was shocking. Matthew was nowhere to be found, but when they made their way to the basement, they found where the screams were coming from. They were coming from a young woman who had been locked in a room in the basement. Turned out that Matthew didn't own the house or the items that he was trying to sell. They belonged to the woman in the basement. Matthew was robbing her. For some inexplicable reason, Matthew actually used his real Facebook account for posting, and Matthew was even his real name. Because of that, the police had no trouble tracking him down. After the encounter with me, he must have taken off but didn't get very far. They caught him later that day. I can only imagine the terror that woman must have felt, being trapped down there. This story happened many years ago when I was in high school. I was babysitting to make some extra cash. It was a simple enough gig for the most part. It was in 2007, so there were none of the apps like today. To find work, my school had a service where parents would sign up, and then I or someone else would be sent out. One weekend, I was asked to babysit for just one night, on Saturday. The job was for one child, a 6-year-old girl. Her dad was a single father, and they lived in a decent-looking suburban house. When I got there, I walked up the path to the front door. Before I could knock or ring the bell, the door swung open. A man stood in front of me, and he must have been the dad. He seemed normal enough and led me into the house. His daughter Kayla was at the kitchen table, working on a coloring book. She looked up for a second to say hi, and then she looked back down. The dad and I talked for another few minutes, and he told me some of the rules for the house. This was all very common, and it was all basic, except for one thing. Right before he left, he told me in no uncertain terms not to go into the basement for any reason. His tone was stern, almost unnerving. I normally wouldn't think too much of something like that because a lot of people have private areas that they don't want some stranger messing around with. It wasn't what he said, though. It was how he said it. It was like he was scolding me, as if I had already broken the rule. The evening started off pretty normal. I played some games with the little girl and read her some stories. Her bedtime was early, so I read her a final bedtime story and then tucked her in. She fell asleep without a fuss, leaving me alone with the TV in the living room. An hour or so passed, and the dad was not expected back until 11:30. Then I heard something, a faint noise coming from the direction of the basement. It sounded like a muffled thump. It was inconsistent, but it came and went a few times each minute. It was too obvious to ignore, so I needed to do something. Maybe it was something important. I worried that somebody was breaking in. My most important job was to protect the little girl, so I decided that I had to check it out. To be honest, I was also a little curious about what was down there. I headed towards the basement door. It was locked, but only with one of those interior door locks that you can open easily with a pen or something. I got it unlocked and pulled the door open. The stairs were carpeted, so I was able to walk down without making any noise. When I got to the bottom, I saw a light coming from under a door at the bottom of the stairs, which struck me as odd. Why would there be a light on in a supposedly off-limits area? The basement was mostly unfinished, with some construction stuff around like they were doing work. The door with the light was the only place that had any walls. The noises were getting louder, and by the time I was on the basement floor, I was pretty sure there was someone down there with me. At the time, I didn't know if it was an intruder or if there was another person in the house the whole time. I guess an intruder would make more sense, because what would be the point of hiring a babysitter if there was another adult there? I walked to the door where the light was coming from. I turned the knob and opened it. It's when I saw a middle-aged man sitting on a chair staring directly at me. He wasn't tied up or anything, and he didn't look distressed, just sitting there calmly as if he was expecting me. Our eyes met, and a chill ran down my spine. I didn't know him. He wasn't the father of the child, and he clearly wasn't someone I was told to expect. In fact, I think I remember being told that it would just be me and the girl. I ran back up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. The man didn't chase me, didn't even move from his chair as far as I could tell. I wanted to leave and run out of that house as fast as I could, but the little girl was asleep upstairs. I couldn't just abandon her, especially if the man was dangerous. I called the police instead, shaking as I dialed the phone. When I told them what happened, they didn't seem to think it was an emergency. They told me they would call the father and get back to me. I stayed there waiting for about 20 minutes, and I saw a police car pull up. At almost the exact same time, the father's car arrived. I looked out the front window as the police and the man talked on the porch. I couldn't tell what they were saying, but at one point the girl's dad laughed. For some reason, that made me really mad. I called the cops to report a potential intruder in his house, where his 6-year-old daughter was. How could anything be funny at a time like that? It was bizarre. After a while, the two of them came up to the house. The man unlocked the front door and stepped inside. He flatly denied knowing anything about a man in the basement. Even more frustrating was that he denied telling me not to go down there. He tried to spin it, saying that he told me that I wouldn't want to go down there because it was under construction. The dad allowed the police to search the house since there was possibly an intruder. They scoured every inch but found nothing. No man, no signs of forced entry, nothing out of place. The police were skeptical of my story, but I knew what I saw. I couldn't explain it and didn't know where the man went. Maybe he snuck out one of the windows. That's all I can think of. The dad tried to seem understanding, suggesting that maybe I had fallen asleep and had a nightmare, but I know I hadn't been dreaming. There was a man in that basement, and I can't fathom his purpose or connection to the family. After the police left, the dad thanked me and paid me for the night, but I thought I caught a dark glare from him as he turned away. Maybe I'm reading into it too much, but I felt something was off with that man. I didn't offer to babysit for him again. and I doubt he wanted me either. I began subletting a rental house cabin for a couple months in 2023 when my dad and I were bucking heads and I needed to move out. The actual renter of the apartment was having his own personal issues causing him to leave the apartment, and I'll just refer to him as my landlord to make it easier. The cabin was an entire unit rental, and it was paid month to month, which was ideal for my temporarily shitty situation. It was 2 floors, technically a small kitchen, decent-sized living space, and 1 bedroom that you had to climb a little flight of stairs to get to, and there was a quirky hatch-type door that you'd have to open to get to the upstairs bedroom. I had already been there for a month. I paid for the second month's rent already by this point, so I was fully situated there. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road with a few other similarly sized cabin-type houses. One was vacant as far as I knew because I never saw cars parked out front or lights on. The other houses, well, I never met the neighbors, but I knew people lived in them. I work 12-hour shifts sometimes, and when I get home, I'm completely exhausted and will just go straight to bed and watch TV until I fall asleep. This was one of those nights. I got home, made a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and a protein shake as my late-night dinner, then went to bed. I always shut the door in the floor every night. I find myself to be uncomfortable at night, having the entrance to your bedroom opened. Something about it makes me feel exposed or vulnerable. Though this door in the floor didn't have a lock, this cabin was made for one person or a couple. I was watching TV in bed when I heard it. A voice from down below saying, "Who's up there?" I instantly felt my heart stop for a second as I shot up to an upright position and sounded like it came from inside the house, but it also could have maybe come from outside. I grabbed the TV remote to turn off the TV. I crawled over to look at the circular window above the bed. I didn't see anyone out there, but it was also very dark. I said, "Who's there?" And the deafening silence that followed afterwards led me to getting off the bed and putting my hand on the handle to the door. I lifted the door and looked down the staircase. I actually said my dad's name, thinking maybe he came over. There was no response. I walked downstairs. I was extremely scared. I flicked on the first light switch I pass. The living room lit up. As I expected in the back of my head, there wasn't anyone down there. I was still talking this up to someone from outside. I turned on the front outside light and looked out the windows, and there wasn't anyone in front. By this point, I was really confused. I turned off the living room light and climbed the stairs back to my bedroom, shutting the door on the floor. I was pretty awake now, so I turned the TV back on. Not even 5 minutes later, I heard pounds on the bedroom door from below. They sounded angry or like they were supposed to scare me. If there was any doubt before this confirmed it. Someone was in the house. I left the TV on this time and just stayed completely motionless because I was genuinely too scared to move an inch. The scariest part was, whoever was down there could easily open the door as there was no lock. I laid silent for about 20 minutes, and once I felt comfortable to move, I looked for my phone. And of course, of all times, it wasn't on my nightstand. I couldn't find it. I may have left it downstairs. So I opened the door of my bedroom and looked down the stairs. With the constantly changing light from the TV screen, I could see just a little bit down the stairs to the living room. So I went down the stairs quietly. And when at the bottom, instead of turning on any lights, I ran out the back door barefoot and ran to the nearest neighbor's house where I knew people lived and I saw their lights were on. I knocked on the door a bunch of times and then I noticed someone at the window next to the door looking at me. I didn't know how long they had been watching me. I yelled through the glass explaining what happened, that I'm his neighbor, and then I need a phone to call the police. He definitely heard me, but he just stared at me. It was unsettling. And I started to back away from the door as I realized he wasn't even responding to me, just creepily watching me. I looked around the road and saw no other houses in the distance with their lights on. Momentarily, I had a thought. What if that guy had something to do with it? I went back to my rental through the back door, which was closed just like I left it. I went inside and locked it and turned on every light in the tiny house. I looked not only for an intruder, but my phone downstairs, and I finally found my phone in my car when I thought to look there. I was so tired earlier that I left it in the center console. I went back inside. The TV was still on up in the bedroom. I climbed the stairs. When I got to the top, I saw someone sitting on my bed staring at the TV. It was a man. I screamed and he turned his head slowly to look at me before I could see anything else. I ran back down the stairs and outside, and now with my phone called 911, I sat in my locked car and I saw someone walking past the backyard of the house disappearing into the woods. I told the operator this when a police car arrived. The one officer checked the house and upstairs room after I told him that I saw someone, most likely the intruder, walk away into the woods. He asked if I had any other places to stay that night, and so I swallowed my pride and went back to my dad's house for the night. After packing some of my important stuff, I returned to the house the next day and stayed another night, then collected the rest of my stuff. Luckily, the landlord agreed to giving me some of my money back. He asked me what the man looked like, and after that, he didn't ask any more questions, which to me is pretty sus. Something was unusual in that situation, from that creepy neighbor ignoring me to the landlord's random, urgent need to move out to someone full-on breaking into the house. Maybe it's all connected, or maybe I'm overthinking it.